The thing about you, Gina, is anything I do, you are supportive. Like we're already starting because there isn't like a need to really start with a therapist because it's already started. Like it started
Ex-
before we started recording.
Yeah, it really did. I
Right.
feel like we have to. It's just two humans trying to do good in the world, and I watch and witness everything that you try to give, and actually no, don't try to give, but do give, and the depth of caring, and so I already feel kind of that camaraderie with you and love the generosity of spirit that you have. So I am grateful to be in this space with you in real time, not in
Yeah.
comment time.
You're so kind. It's nice. Gina reminded me to record, and I am recording because yesterday I had an event where I forgot to hit record, and we had the most lovely conversation. And Gina is so supportive. Like this is the thing. For those of you who have not talked to a therapist, I think it is one of the greatest gifts in the world. I think you are a gift. The fact, like even just talking to you and being here, and I know this isn't therapy, this is a podcast, but it's just a sense of safety.
Mm.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with Gina Moffa, she is a therapist, a grief therapist. You do a lot of therapy. So, we're going to talk about so many things, but a grief therapist. And I think this idea of grief, I have to be honest with you because it's the only way that I can really communicate is I
Mhm.
really wasn't looking forward to talking to you. Okay.
Hear that all the time.
Right. But on a podcast, and I'll talk to my therapist about this and I'll be like, you know, Matt, I'm really not looking forward to talking to you today. And he'll be cool with that. But like truly the idea of grief, the idea of grief, Gina, and talking about grief, I think it's so scary.
Mhm.
It's like, and I don't think people want to talk about grief. And to set this up, I wanted to really kind of make this much more accessible. And we'll
Yeah.
talk about your book and I love your different podcasts where you've been a guest and I just think your book is so wonderful and I'm so grateful to have it and I'm grateful that you created this. But this idea of grief, I think sometimes people think of the word grief and they think of just crying in the fetal position, just complete free fall of emotion. But
Mhm.
when you talk about grief, how do you define grief so that we can not make it just about one thing that's so scary and awful and painful?
Well, I should say sometimes it is in the fetal position, but I think that if we think of it as an experience that we have all already experienced, right? Every part of our life, milestones, graduations, job changes, different huge transitions, breakups, the things that we don't normally associate with grief actually are grief. So the way that I define grief is really an emotional or a full body response, really, to a significant loss that has any meaning for us. And when we look at it that way, it could actually also feel overwhelming. But the truth is, if we already look at the things we've survived and the losses that we've endured, we're already halfway there. We just have never had the language for it. And I
Yeah,
think that we think of death as, the ultimate of all grief, but we experience so much more grief before we even get to this place.
I think that is so important. And I really want people to think about this because I get the message from a parent who says, my teenager lost a friend. I mean, can't
Yeah.
even imagine, just how unspeakable that is and what they're going through. And the parent tries to figure out what can I do? We want to know what can I do to help my daughter in this particular case because I get these messages
Mhm.
and then I have to respond. And then I get the message from a student who's dealing with the loss of a parent, being in
Yeah.
college, being a teenager. Harlan, what do I do? So those are like the extremes. All right. So we'll talk about those because
Hmm.
I want to get to like the basics of grieving because I think we need like a grieving 101 because I know there's so much I don't know and there's so much that the people who listen to this don't know. So we'll do that. But then what I really want to hit on as well is, and I have a list of, I've got a lot. Okay. So I'm gonna rattle through this. Okay. And make sure everything is quiet here. Okay. Grieving the loss when a child goes to college. Okay.
hmm
Grieving the loss of a partner after a breakup. Grieving the loss of a friendship. Grieving the loss of a sense of self, which I think so many of us go through so many changes in our life where one part of us dies in a sense and another part is reborn. And that can really throw people, especially when it happens for the first time or it's a big life change that's either unexpected or expected.
Yeah.
Grieving the loss of childhood. It's I love that one. My 11-year-old's like, I really like being a child. He's like very
Oh,
self-aware. He's like,
I love that.
it's so cool. And I'm like,
Hold on tight.
right. He's like, I like this part of my life, which I thought was really insightful. Grieving the loss of your high school identity, which from high school to college, that big change. Grieving the loss of the different stage of life, whether it's graduation, divorce, retirement. Grieving the loss, of course, of someone you love. Grieving the loss of a career change. Grieving the loss of a pet, which is someone you love, the loss. Are there more things that you think I've missed in terms of just defining grieving, giving it this really big shape and form that isn't just that thing that, so many people, I think, define grief by?
Yeah, one of the things I would also talk about is the grief, sort of different types of ambiguous loss. Sometimes our kids will have a diagnosis in college, a mental health diagnosis, and maybe it becomes more progressive. And so there can be sort of chronic mental health conditions or even chronic illness that can happen as we get older or even just in teenage years. So I think that we often don't look at chronic illness in any form as grief. But again, it's a different angle of a change in identity, but it changes everything around us. And so there's so much ambiguous loss in what you've shared that I'm really excited about because people don't really understand that. So
Yeah. And I think that it makes it more accessible because the part that I wasn't looking forward to is, right now I'm in a phase of my life where I have both of my parents. I'm so grateful and so blessed. I'm an adult and they're getting older.
yeah,
And we've shared so much. It's a gift. I know you in the book, and just to let everybody know, the book is Moving On, doesn't mean letting go, and it's a beautiful book, and it's something I'm so grateful that I have. I have it. I have the Kindle version. I've got the regular version, the audio
my gosh.
version. I just because I need to absorb things in different ways. And I
Same.
really need those different inputs. And I think it's really helpful to have different ways of being able to be comforted and consoled. But the thing that I was really concerned about is, I don't want to think about big loss. I don't want to do a dress rehearsal. And I want to avoid thinking about grieving as long as I possibly can. So that was the aversion to this, and you were kind enough to say, we don't have to do this now. I think if I didn't do this now, I would keep putting it off because for me, grief is so associated with the fear of losing someone I love. And I'm so scared of that. But the part that made this more accessible, and hopefully for people who are listening, that you don't have to think about that. Okay. So let's just put that in a little compartment and we can file that away unless you want to. You can process this conversation however you want. But the part of grieving the loss of a friend and being able to grieve the loss of your child leaving, my son's leaving for camp for 8 weeks. It's really exciting. So sad.
Yeah,
So
of course. And every camp year, he's getting closer to college where you'll say, goodbye for longer periods of time. But I'm not putting that out there because
Gina,
then you're really not going to want to talk to me.
my other kid's leaving for college in August. So
Wait, I didn't know they were that old yet.
Yeah, I know. It's
I knew
wild.
you had 3, but I didn't know that they were that old yet.
So 18, 16, and 11.
Oh, right. Okay.
So everyone's in these different phases. But yes, so all of that. And that's really the set to make this, I want to make this as accessible as possible. And this is just how I was internalizing the conversation and why I was
Mhm.
just a little bit reluctant. But I think that when it comes to all of these different areas of our life, we can all grab onto a piece. And I think that's
Mhm.
so important. And I think what you said, and also in the book, you refer to one of your clients who couldn't acknowledge that they've dealt with loss. Can you visit that for a moment just to help other people to understand that we have dealt with loss?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really common, that I actually have a lot of clients that will come to me and they won't have it readily available on their consciousness that they have already gone through something before. Um, and so I think that, we just often associate, like just like I said, we associate our grief with something kind of big and huge and significant. A lot of people, if you think of kids, a lot of the times their very first loss is the loss of a pet. Not every time, but more commonly, the
Yeah.
loss of a pet. And that feels really big, and that really does shape how we see grief and how we look at grief and how we look at loss. And so as parents, we have an opportunity to say, well, I'm actually going to model this. And how I model the way that we look at loss and grief is going to be the way that I teach my child. And that comes from society, right? That comes from
Right.
our own misconceptions and our own ways of looking at how we deal with loss, which I can see with you is hard, right? And so but I think it's that way for so many people that we often don't even want to acknowledge the things that we have already experienced. And so we start with, we can start with anything, these identity things, everything you've listed, it is a huge loss in a lot of ways. It's just very interesting how we can circumvent that to have it mean something else. We won't use the terms grief or loss because grief really constitutes something big, this dark abyss. But we
Yeah.
can say transition or change, or growth. And those things don't seem as scary. So to me, it's really about using the language and learning how not to be afraid of it, because we have all experienced it in all of these different ways.
Yeah. The pain of loss, and I think so much of it is connected to rejection. I
Hmm.
have this obsession with rejection.
You do.
Well, because I feel like at the root of so much of our pain is this fear of acknowledging our truth, which oftentimes means having to face things we don't want to see. And those things
Hmm.
we don't want to see and acknowledge, when we don't do that, in a sense, we're rejecting reality,
Hmm.
rejecting ourselves, and not being present. So when it comes to just allowing yourself to acknowledge grief, where do we even start? And I know it's such a big question, but someone who's going through pain, any of the pain associated with any of the loss that we've shared and touched on, where do you start?
Now, are we starting as a person in the world
We
looking at
start
our grief?
we're starting as someone who, let's say, as a person, right? As a person who is dealing with some sort of, maybe it's a friendship loss, maybe it's a death, it's a breakup, it's someone who's feeling these big feelings. Is there a place to start? How does someone take that first step in acknowledging what's happening and being able to start working through it?
Mhm. Well, you actually just answered it because the first step is acknowledging what happened. I think sometimes we want to put it to the side, and there's this very big consensus in the world that of capitalism, let's say, of just keep it moving, of just, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and don't take things too personally and just keep going. There's the good vibes only and emotional bypassing, and for me, the first step is acknowledging what's happened, looking at it factually if we can, but also then looking at our feelings. We don't allow ourselves or one another to really feel what we feel. And that can mean I sit in that sense of rejection for a little while. And I think of myself as feeling disconnected, right? Because rejection is about attachment. And now I am not attached anymore. Am I still attached to me? There's so much feeling in that we get to actually, we get to explore it, we get to stew in it sometimes, but really I think so much of the time we don't come to these things with a sense of patience, presence, and compassion for ourselves. And
Yeah.
so that's really where I would say we have to start, is acknowledging it with a sense of presence and compassion. Instead of this old kind of get over it, good vibes only, we can just keep it moving, energy that we have so much now lately.
Right. And that's a really important place for everyone to start with that truth, the truth of what is, knowing that it's
Mhm.
going to be really scary to face it. Sometimes we don't even get to anticipate what we're going to face because it just hits us. And I know you talk in the book about this free fall. And I think anyone who's dealt with a breakup or loss, something that really happens suddenly that creates that really big feeling. Can you describe that and help people to understand just what that feeling is and what that first, I don't want to say it's reaction, but I know you talked about this so beautifully with the loss of your mom.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a term that I call grief fall, and it is this very initial moment. You haven't entered grief yet. You haven't entered the loss or the emotional experience, but it is this one moment where we get the news, or somebody breaks up with us, or we're holding our pet's paw, as they put in the needle, and we recognize that nothing will ever be the same. And that can be the day you drop your child off to college and you watch them turn around and wave, right? And what it elicits in us is this visceral response where we feel like we're just falling and we're not exactly sure where we're going to land. But we know that nothing will ever be the same from this moment forward. And everybody who's experienced a big life event, big transition, or significant loss, has experienced this grief fall. And for me, I needed a visual for it, because I was standing at the edge of 77th Street in Manhattan when I got a phone call that my mom had died, as I was sort of on my way back to her, and everything stopped. And I felt my stomach drop, and I just felt like I was falling. And I think that there's a moment that everyone can relate to where something really big happened, and you just know from that moment forward, you're changed, irreversibly transformed by this news. Um, and I think it's a moment that we would all wish to not experience at all, but it is really a very common experience. And I don't know anybody, at least who's over the age of 18, who hasn't experienced something like this.
Yeah. I think that part, the connection of the pit in your stomach, just this sense
Mhm.
of just complete lack of control and new emotions and not knowing what to do with this and the overwhelm of the moment, just creating this sensory experience that is
Mhm.
so overwhelming and hard to work through because they're new feelings. Like this idea of being an adult or being a child, or just, it's like someone opens, I would imagine they're opening a new door, and all of a sudden it is like a flood of all of these new feelings. Would you say that's
Mhm.
an accurate portrayal of
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. And I also would add that it's important to understand that there's a really huge neurological component involved. Whether it is the loss of a child, a pet, a job, a divorce, um, yes, we will have that visceral reaction, that flood of feelings will come. But our brain is really, it's very happy when things are predictable and when things are safe. And so when we get that flood, our brain just thrusts us and our nervous system into survival mode. And so there's no distinction between the details of what's going on and our actual nervous system reaction. And that really is sort of the start of a lot of this. The brain has to, let's just say, relearn a
Right.
new way to live in this world and orient itself in this world again with this new news.
Right.
And that is really sort of the biggest initial transformation that we go through.
Right. Yeah, I have this expression, information is not emotional. And my wife and my son were like, no, it is emotional. Information is emotional. And I was like, well, information is data. And then the data then triggers these emotions. But then they said, when you say information isn't emotional, it negates the fact that information is so deeply connected to emotions that when you say that, it almost makes it so if you make it emotional, you're doing something wrong.
Mm,
I don't know what you think of, because it is this data, but when you hear something or someone says, I can't see you anymore, it's not working. It's like the lights go out. It's like,
yeah.
yes, it is information, but it's so connected to the emotion that it becomes so overwhelming, and we don't know what to do. And so much of this conversation
Yeah.
is wanting to know, how do we deal with the unknown? And I know we can't prepare and we can't rehearse this, but for so many of the people who I help and who look to me to guide them, they're dealing with first times, and they
Yeah.
don't know what they're feeling, and they don't know how to process these emotions because they're all so new.
Mhm.
So the first is the grief fall. And if we can walk people through this process, and you would be better to lead the way than I would. And I know in the book you walk people through this process, but it might be different in terms of our conversation of, what are there are the stages of grief, but what do people
No,
feel?
no
And
stages.
okay, because I didn't see you list the stages of grief in the book, which is interesting.
I will never list the stages of grief because can I explain it
Yeah, I
quickly?
would love for
Just
you
so we're
to,
here.
because it's so
Yeah.
important.
It's important to understand that, first of all, with all respect to Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who created the 5 stages of grief, she created them with the intention of them um, to be used with terminally ill patients who will have a beginning, middle, and end to their stages, right? And so it was really created to help them come to terms with the finality of their lives. What happened was is that there really wasn't a modern protocol for grievers. We had Freud, who had in Mourning and Melancholia the idea that the purpose of grieving is to detach. We've now since learned that is not the case, but we really didn't have a lot happening. So a lot of grievers jumped onto the 5 stages of grief because it gave them some structure. And for that purpose, I think it's really helpful. What it doesn't take into account, if we are going to go in that direction, is that grief is a full body experience. It doesn't take into account any of the biological or physiological manifestations of grief, which are in plenitude. It doesn't take into account anxiety. It doesn't take into account the fact that grief is nonlinear, that grief does not just go for 5 stages. There's no beginning, middle, and end. Nothing is neat about it. It doesn't take into account dreams. I mean, there's so much that it doesn't take into account, and a lot of complicated other emotions that come along with it. But, I think for the purpose of having some structure in an otherwise very unpredictable experience, it does a very simple job of helping people at least know that if they're feeling angry, it's normal. If they're feeling, they're denying it, it's normal. But it definitely can make people feel like there's a right and a wrong way to grieve when there really isn't. And what happens if I don't feel one of these things in the stages of grief? Or what happens if I feel stuck in one of those things? Or what happens if I don't feel any of them? Am I grieving wrong? And I get that a lot in my work. And everyone seems to think there's a right way and a wrong way to do grief. And that makes this very dangerous. And so I have a lot of feelings about that, just
Yeah.
in terms of like, we're all very different. We have a different relationship to our losses. Every loss has a different meaning for us. We also have our own history with either grief or trauma, high adrenaline in our bodies, history of anxiety or mental health challenges. These things all have to be taken into account. And they aren't. So we really run the risk of simplifying a very messy and complicated experience.
Yeah. I like to simplify things. I like to take complex ideas and to make them more manageable by creating systems. And
Mhm.
when it comes to grief, I think that's also the part where, and where I think it's like what you're saying is really scary, but it's
Yeah.
also comforting. But you're saying, okay, the system of looking through grief, it's really flawed, and I'm like,
It's getting
okay.
better.
Right. Well, we have you, and we have other leaders and
Sure.
authors, and there's several go-to books, and I think your book is really beautiful in creating. It really does create it creates such a comfortable way of being able to exist in such a scary place.
Thank you. That's really the point.
Yeah, it really does. And what I would like by the time we're done chatting is chat. Such a funny.
It is chatting. We're just talking about neurobiology of grief.
uh, is if there isn't a framework, at least maybe a guide. Maybe at least the guide. I know the book's a guide, and to go back to your words in the book, in the introduction, you wrote, "I'm sorry, I see you. I'm here. I care." And as someone who's trying to console someone who's working through grief, these words of "I'm sorry, I see you, I am here, I care." Can you break down those sentences, those words, and why you chose that and why that's so important as someone who is walking side by side with someone who's working through their feelings of loss and grief?
Yeah. And number one, as a therapist, one of the things that feels so important to me is the idea of creating a sense of safety and creating a sense of safe witnessing. A lot of people come to me feeling very invalidated by the people around them. There's the family. Someone in the family is always going through something worse. Their experience is bigger or, more important. Friends, let's look at even college age kids. There's very few people that can identify with what they're going through. They feel very alone. And I would say that out of the feelings that come into my practice, loneliness, isolation, a sense of deep aloneness existentially after a loss is the most prevalent. And so for me, I wanted to write a book that provided a sense of understanding to the point where we could potentially have a sense of agency over something very unpredictable. But I wanted to do it in a way that felt like you were actually in my office, sitting across from me, and I am here. Because I think that we can so easily intellectualize and create distance. And I think the more I can say, I'm here, let's stop, let's go through this chapter together. Let's take a pause. If it's too much, put this book down, throw it across the room for all I care. But it's really important that we can do this together and that you're not alone and that you are witnessed. Because that sense of aloneness is so huge after loss. Nobody will ever understand what our individual experience is. And that is the hardest thing, I think, within any kind of grief experience.
Yeah.
So that's my country road answer.
Yeah. And for someone who is trying to console someone or help someone to work through their feelings, do you think those words of "I'm sorry, I see you, I'm here, I care," I was trying to figure out how someone who's a friend or a partner or someone who cares, the idea of taking one of those expressions and filling that role of, I'm here, I care. You could be all of those things. But what could someone who is trying to help someone to work through their grief, what is the most important thing they can do?
The most important thing they can do is show up consistently without pressuring them to change, without pushing them in one direction or another, without invalidating their feelings or experiences, without saying the dreaded, at least it isn't worse, or, everything happens for a reason, to come without platitudes and to come with authenticity and consistency. I think that when people are going through loss, we need people around us who see us and also can be consistently present in them, and allowing us to be us, whatever this mess looks like in the moment. And so, I think we really care. People care and people want to help. But sometimes we push our own belief systems or our own desires or our own impatience on them. And we miss the whole ability to connect deeply. And so people will not feel seen, right? Somebody came up to me after my mom died and said, at least your mom's not suffering anymore. At least your mom's in a better place. That misses me completely. You're not seeing me at all. You're saying something that society has pre-programmed you to say.
Right.
And really what I want is to have consistent, genuine connection. And that is really it. And so I think if we can start with simple things, I have no idea what to say, but I'm here for you. I have no idea. This is so awkward. I'm really bad with death, but I care and I'm here.
Right.
Stuff like that, it's okay to be awkward. What it's
Right.
not okay to do is disappear because of that sense of being awkward. And I think so many people do, right? I'm forcing you to talk to me about this, but if you could, you'd be doing something else on a Friday morning. And so, it is so indicative of how grief illiterate we all are, that we're all so uncomfortable and with the idea of even being present for someone else's loss. It's hard. I have a lot of empathy for it. I really do.
Yeah.
Because we just haven't been taught.
Grief illiterate. Oh, that's such a great expression. Because where do we learn about this? How do we learn?
Unfortunately, I would say that we learn, most of the time going through it ourselves, right? A lot of people say you don't know grief until you experience it. And a lot of that is true, because we don't have a real sense of empathy for people. We can have sympathy, right? There's no empathy cards, there's sympathy cards. And so, we're not really willing to go into that dark place with somebody a lot of the time. And it is hard, right? So I think that society definitely has created fillers for us to have pseudo connection with people. So it seems like we're doing the right thing. But so often we just aren't able to go there because as children, our parents want to protect us. They don't want us to see hard things. And so then we don't really learn. We also don't have the right language. People say, so-and-so went away. So-and-so passed on, right? None of that is clear to a child. And what that does is it instills fear. Well, what if so-and-so goes away now and they don't come back? And so we have to really give our children the benefit of the doubt that, of course, age appropriately, that they can hear hard things and that the truth appropriately discussed is actually going to create more grief-informed children and adults, in the world.
When we experienced the loss of a pet suddenly last year, it's the 1-year anniversary, and we talk about the loss of our pet. He was 4 years old, and it was very sudden and unexpected, and everybody had to grieve. And it was especially difficult for me to watch my youngest just cry, just cry, and I had no way to help him to stop crying, because my job wasn't to get him to stop crying.
Right.
My job was to be there when he cried and to let him cry as long as he needed to cry, which makes me want to cry. But
and that's okay.
Is that the right thing to do? Is there?
It is the right thing to do.
Or the healthiest thing? I don't want to say right or wrong. Right's such a bad word in this conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah,
but
and you can correct me with anything, Gina.
Okay,
if I say something, you have free reign to be like, Harlan, no, like you don't have to be gentle with me. Okay, I'm not like
I am gentle by nature, but I got you.
Yeah, like call me out, because I am grief illiterate. I am
Thank you for saying that.
Oh, I'm so uncomfortable with this. The whole conversation, the whole concept. And I feel, and even this conversation now, it's like we kind of bounced around, and I'm like, what is it that I really want to communicate, and how can I be so helpful? And I think even in this conversation, Gina, while I'm the one who's hosting this conversation, I want to make sure that when this conversation is over, that the 16-year-old who lost someone can leave going, okay, I have something that can help. Or the parent who is trying to work through the loss of self, can have some type of tool. And I know that we started with the grief free fall, and I was using your book as kind of a guide, but I'd really like you to even guide me, for me to give you permission to like, let's make this great and valuable, great in the sense of providing some sort of like utility. I was even thinking while you're talking the grief free fall, like what if I don't experience a grief free fall? Because my way of processing, I tend to, when dealing with trauma, I'm the youngest of 3 kids. I want to make sure things are okay. My feelings and processing my feelings are not the most important thing to do until everyone's okay. Like, I need to take care of everyone. So maybe I'm not going to experience a grief free fall. And if I don't
Not right away.
right. Okay. So you don't have to. So this is the thing. There is no right or wrong way for everyone to experience this. So you might experience your grief free fall a year later. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. It's yes. And, and I talk about this in, I don't know, a number of podcasts, but the truth is that our ability to take in information and process feelings, right? We can't feel when we're in a state of shock, and we can't feel when we're in a state of survival, right? We're getting chased by a bear. We're not going to say, wow, I have a lot of feelings about this. I'm going to have to talk about this on Tuesday in my next session. No, we're running from the bear. And this is applicable to caretakers and parents, people who have to go back to work right away and don't have, and I call it the luxury of grieving sometimes, because, or if you're in survival mode, or, and you have to take care of your whole family, grieving itself and feeling your feelings can be a luxury. And it's okay to not feel what you feel right away. It's really okay. There's no, like I say this a lot in the book, there's no right way to do this. There's no right timeline on how to process feelings, except that you must at some point. We can't push them down forever. But the fact that you go into survival mode and become sort of the patriarch who goes into, the trauma response of caretaking, that's okay. That is then your role and the rhythm that you've taken on. And that's okay. I'm not going to say don't do that forever, because that will inevitably lead you to bypassing, and it will come up in your body in all different types of ways physiologically. But I think that we have to make sure that we don't have this is what happens and this is what happens next, and then this is what happens next, and here's what you do. For the most part, everything will happen in some sequence for people. The grief fall will come when we're able to process that nothing will ever be the same and take in this information. If we take in information only intellectually, we will then jump into survival mode, and our nervous system won't actually allow us to feel what we feel.
Right.
There's just nothing around that. So, there's no right or wrong, because there's nothing wrong with our nervous system. It's doing its job.
Right. I think that's really comforting and liberating, because in your book, you list so many different stages, or not even, I don't want to use the word stage, but so many, how would you describe it? Different aspects, different phases, perhaps, or personalities or types of grief.
What I talk about actually are grief rhythms in my book, and there are things that shift and change. There are things that they're actually rhythm. I chose the word rhythms because I, first of all, like the feel of it.
Yeah.
Because rhythms change and we're not set in concrete. So if we look at the way we cope with a lot of really hard things in our life, we will all have some sort of rhythm. We will either dive into it, we will avoid it, we will keep moving, we will be totally, we will stop in our tracks and not be able to do anything. They're the people that go out and buy all the books on the topic so they can understand it, right? And it's just important to know maybe what our coping rhythm can be, but it doesn't necessarily talk about stages. I think what the point of that for me was so that we could give each other that sense of grace and compassion, and not say, whoa, somebody is avoiding their grief. No, if you read this book and you understand it, you'll see that they're in this particular rhythm. Right. And that rhythm is not set in stone. It doesn't mean that they're not grieving, and it doesn't mean that grief is not, the tab running in the background of their computer. It just is the rhythm that they're in. Nothing is fixed, nothing is right or wrong, everything can change. And it's just important that we can have an understanding of our own ways of coping with things. And that is applicable to all of the different types of grief that you mentioned earlier in our conversation, because every type of grief that you have could elicit a different type of response. And so it's important to know, though, that we can cope in one way with sort of everything that's hard, and that it's okay.
Right. And
does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Again, it's really liberating because we don't know what our rhythm is until we are in the midst of a life experience.
Yes.
And different experiences will elicit different feelings and different physical responses that will have a rhythm. And then it's teasing out what is this, and noting the experience, noting what rhythm it is, what beat it is, what song it is, and then being able to talk through that. And I think we get to acknowledging that it's happening, just giving ourselves permission to acknowledge it, which I think so many people struggle with, because it's so scary to acknowledge it, because what does this mean? And how does this impact tomorrow, which is full of uncertainty? And this particular beat might then bring up something that I don't want to acknowledge from my past, or an attachment or a trauma that's so scary. But if we understand it's okay, it's okay, and that's part of the process, then I think it becomes less intimidating. It's not so scary. I think so. Just the unknown is your rhythm, but the fact that there is a rhythm, and
there's a rhythm. Yeah, there's a rhythm that you can learn and identify with. There's a rhythm that you will probably know is yours right away, because it will be a pattern in your life, right? I am somebody who personally goes to dive into things. I want to learn everything I can about this experience that I'm having. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people have other rhythms, right? But what that does is it helps me say, oh, this is normal. This is a real thing. This is a coping mechanism that I have, that now I can learn what to do next to take care of myself. Right? If we have people who just move and don't stop, and this is a lot of people too, right? They get very busy. They fill their calendar when things get hard, and they just keep moving, right? And what that does, though, is then we understand that that is their coping rhythm, that is their coping mechanism, and that is okay and normal. We're not judging it whatsoever. But what we can do is, as a therapist or as a friend or as a parent or as even a teacher, we can say, okay, so I noticed that you're doing this rhythm. Maybe what you can do instead is incorporate maybe just taking a walk or slowing down. I'm okay with distractions as long as it's not forever, right? But if somebody is going, and that's their coping mechanism, a little bit at a time, we want to get them out of that and slow things down for them so we can get the cortisol levels to drop, because otherwise they're going to be staying in a state of anxiety. It's really about understanding what our experience is, not judging it, but understanding it. Because to me, in all of my years, 20 years of being a therapist working with trauma and loss, it is incredibly terrifying when people do not know what they're experiencing. There's no name for it. There's no understanding. There's no description of it. And that's why grief remains so elusive to so many people, because we don't know what we're experiencing. Our needs change. We don't know how we feel from one moment to the next, because it can change. But if we know that we cope in a certain way, and that it's okay, and that it's here described, and we now know what steps we can take to take care of ourselves, or we can hand this to someone we love, right? I can say, here's the rhythm. Go read it. Go and now you'll understand, and you'll be able to tell me how, we can work together and figure out how to help. It's about having a map that feels okay to also go off the trails, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. And I have sensory overload when I'm talking to you, because it's a positive thing. It's a good thing, because I'm trying to think of, okay, well, if somebody has dealt with a breakup and someone has experienced other loss in their life, can the rhythm of those losses, and rhythm is, how you work through it,
how you cope. The initial coping mechanisms,
right, how you're coping with that. Can you then, do those patterns tend to repeat when it comes to future loss, and can that help?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm clear in this chapter where I talk about the rhythms, that even within one loss, your rhythms can shift and change, or you can have 3 of them, right? You can sort of cycle through a couple of them. But yeah, that will repeat. Really, to me, it's about understanding the ways in which we cope with hard things. All of us have a tendency towards coping, right? If I were to ask you, Harlan, how do you cope with hard things?
Right.
Across the board,
Right.
you can probably come up with something that across the board is very similar in every scenario.
Right. I think that's really helpful. I love to get information. Yeah, I want to understand what I need to do so that I can know what I'm feeling is something that's predictable or familiar. And
Mhm.
I love turning to people who have been able to process it and come up with different ways of being able to work through those challenges.
Yeah.
And I think just talking through. So, okay, let's get into some specific scenarios. Okay.
Mhm.
So you are a student. You're a student and you deal with the loss of a friend. I get this question, Harlan. My friend died in a terrible accident. Um, I don't know what to do.
Mhm.
How do we start? What can I tell someone? How can they help themselves?
How old are they?
Teenager, 17.
Teenager. Yeah. I mean, to me, I have questions, right? What is their support system like? Do they have friends or family they can trust? Who do they talk to when it comes to hard things? That's important to me. How do they take care of themselves? Do they drink enough water? Are they self-medicating? Do they distract with Netflix all day, every day when they're out of school? It's important to sort of say, okay, this is a traumatic experience for a teenager to lose a friend and probably to be pretty isolated, unless it's like, there's a big group of people. But I would want to know where the support system lies. Who do you
Right.
talk to about things? Who do you feel safe talking to about things? And how are you taking care of yourself right now? Those are
Right.
sort of the starting points that I think are important when it comes to teenagers. We're not necessarily going to go into like the neurology, the neurobiology of what's happening to their brain. I think that it's important to create a safe place for them. Teenagers already don't feel safe in their own skin. They want to belong and they want to feel safe. That's really the two main things that are the most important, right? And so a loss of some kind can be either isolating, or if they have, if this person had a sense of community, maybe people are coming together.
Right.
But I would say, how are you taking care of yourself? And are you isolating, or are you able to talk to people and feel you can confide and get support? Those are the questions I would ask.
Right. What about someone who says, I have all these people, but I don't want to talk about it?
And it's okay to not necessarily talk about it as long as you're not secretively holding it in. So I would say then, well, what are you doing in terms of moving your body, right? Grief is like an energy that is in our bodies. So are you sitting down and immobilized by this grief? Or are you somebody who's moving around a lot, like we talked about before? So this is kind of the second thing, right? I say, where's your support system? If you don't want to talk about it, what are you doing with your body? Are you moving your body? Are you resting your body? Are you getting your body enough nutrients and enough water?
Right.
And how are we moving something through, right? It's like anxiety. Anxiety has to be moved through in a lot of ways. And we don't look at it as an energy in a lot of ways, but it is important for us to look at the body when it comes to loss and grief. And a lot of people only look at it as an emotional experience. So if you don't want to talk about it, I would say, are you able to feel your feelings when you're alone? Are you able to feel your feelings in front of people without talking about it? It's okay if you even sit in front of somebody and just cry, or sit in front of somebody and punch your pillow.
Right.
It's just important that it gets out of your body. And
Right.
so that would be my next round of questioning.
And then when someone says, I'm fine, it's not a problem, I'm doing
Mhm.
fine, and they genuinely believe they're doing fine, they might be doing fine, but at what point, if at any point, does someone need to process those feelings?
I think that people have this assumption that they can hold things in forever. But, I thought I was fine after the loss of my mom until I realized that I had pancreatitis and was in the ER and admitted to the hospital. There were a lot of things that I just thought, and I'm not a teenager, but I was a therapist who thought she got grief right, and so of course, if I'm a grief therapist, it would be really so dumb if I couldn't do grief right, right? And I was desperately humbled by the whole experience. But all of that to say is that it's going to come out one way or another, no matter how we say we're fine. It will come out in our behavior, it will come out in our habits and patterns, or it will come out in our physiology. So we can say we're fine, but it will come out in one form or another. And so, I think that when people say they're fine, it's a lot of the time because they don't feel safe to say anything else.
Right.
And so, and I respect that, right? Because I can't ever just say to someone who comes in my office, you're in a safe place. This is a safe space. It's not. It's something we create together, but it does take time, right? I don't know when somebody says they're fine, what their background is. Do they have trauma? Have they ever felt safe, right? So
Right.
I don't want to push them in any way. And that's where, people often kind of poo-poo therapists or therapy.
Right.
But I think that what we can appreciate about the training is that we're thinking about all different types of a person holistically. We're thinking about their histories. We're thinking about their physiology.
Right.
We're thinking about their, support system. And all of this really comes into play, especially with grief, because it is such an unspoken, an unaccepted experience in the world that people often do say, I'm fine, because they believe that that's what people want them to feel and say.
Right. And they might genuinely believe it. Because I think also not knowing what they're feeling and saying they're fine may be genuine, but then there's these other things that come up that we need to look at. How does trauma, and explain for people who don't know what trauma is or a definition of trauma, and I want to get really down to, the fundamentals. First of all, what is trauma? And then second of all, how does trauma, and I'm thinking a lot of people who are, 20, 21, 23, very new adults, independent adults, how does trauma growing up impact their ability to cope with big life loss?
Well, trauma is in and of itself is an experience that happens to us that is outside of our ability and our nervous system's ability to cope with it, right? It's our response to something very, very big, and something outside of the scope of our ability to deal with it or contend with it. One of the things that happens when we have trauma in our lives or trauma history is that it will and can make grief a little bit more complicated, because what will come up will be a sense of our survival mode, right? So you've heard me say this a lot. The nervous system plays a really big role. It plays the largest role when it comes to trauma and loss. Now, this can either be a traumatic loss, as in a sudden and unexpected loss, according to the American Psychological Association, which I don't necessarily agree with, since it's a maddeningly vague description of traumatic loss. For me, a traumatic loss is something that where your nervous system is really affected, right? If somebody comes in and says they're traumatized by something because they've had a loss, even if it's a death-related loss that they were expecting, quote unquote, somebody was sick for a long period of time, this can still be traumatizing to someone who has a trauma history. Because what that does is, remember, our nervous system is imprinted with all of these memories. And its only job, and the brain's only job, is to keep us safe and alive. So if something happens that brings up an imprinted memory of something that has already happened that feels very similar to us and puts us in a state of survival, we will be re-traumatized. And so it's important to note that whether or not the loss is considered a traumatic loss, whether it's violent, unexpected, or sudden, that there's a lot more to the story, and that our nervous system is the captain of the ship. And so a lot of people will come into me and they'll say, yeah, I can't stop thinking about this. I'm ruminating. I am feeling so much, anxiety around this. I can't stop. I can't stop looking for a different outcome. There's a lot of things, and that can happen also with breakups and, with friendship loss, when that happens, we have to really pay attention to the fact that this person is in a survival mode and they're not going to be able to feel any of their feelings. They're going to be thinking about the situation over and over and over and over. They're not going to feel safe. They're going to be ruminating. They're going to be wishing for a different outcome, and they're going to be panicking quite a bit. Anxiety will be sort of the leading factor in this loss. And so we can notice that when we can see, oh, okay, somebody is so anxious right now in their loss, and they're just talking about ruminating. This can happen with survivor's guilt a lot of the time as well, where they just ruminate with the wishful thinking that we can change the ending. It's important to note that, because that can inevitably lead to something called prolonged grief disorder, which is a relatively new diagnosis, which many people dislike. I don't mind it because I do feel, although it can potentially pathologize a human experience, it is important to get research and money behind grief and attention, and therefore insurance panels can cover it. So this feels important to me for the long run. So that's my sidebar on that. But I think it's important. I'm giving you a really convoluted answer in some ways, because at the end of the day, a trauma history with somebody will alter the course, or can alter the course of their reaction to a loss, if their trauma has not been something that they have metabolized in any way or have ever talked about. It could even come up if they have felt like they've gotten through it,
Right.
because it's the nervous system.
Right. I think that makes it much easier to understand if someone breaks up with you, or you are experiencing any loss, even if you fail an exam. It's like the loss of who am I? This is not who I am. I'm an A student. And that sudden situation, the shocking situation, can be traumatic, which can be connected to other traumatic situations in life that can cause someone to have this really big reaction that might not seem right-sized.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Exactly it.
Right.
Because it's their nervous system responding to a survival instinct.
Right. And someone might be thinking, what's wrong with me? And, I get messages from students. I say students, I get messages from people all ages, but they write these very long messages that are clearly them trying to work through a traumatic situation. There's just these very long rants of a situation that's pretty matter of fact, but it feels so much bigger and is bigger because it's connected to an event or trauma, and their body and brain are then going on this autopilot of trying to protect them.
Yes.
For this. And then when you're someone who is a witness to this, and you see someone who's not thinking in a way that is rational and present, catastrophizing, getting caught in these loops, what is it that, two questions, what is it that someone can do if they can be self-aware enough to recognize, oh, brain, you're having a trauma response? What can they do? And what could someone who is trying to help someone who can't be self-aware or is so lost in that moment get through that? So there are two situations.
Yeah, I mean, I really believe, look, at some point I was going to have to say it. Therapy. I really believe that getting professional support when you find yourself ruminating and in a place where your trauma response is taking over the show and you're not able to function, not being able to get into a place where you have peer support and anything that feels like you're just not alone. Because when you're in this state of a trauma response, a lot of the time you feel really alone and isolated, and you feel like no one will really ever understand. These are the times that I think reaching out for professional help in some capacity is going to be the answer. It really is the answer, because we are trained to help somebody out of that experience. Having a full body experience when it comes to a traumatic loss cannot just be talked out of. There has to be a safe place for somebody to discuss, co-regulate, and potentially have somatic types of therapy, whether it's EMDR or somatic experiencing or any other type of thematic type of therapy. That is going to be the path. there are going to be times where if it's a full body experience, we won't be able to just simply use talk therapy or talk to our friend or talk to Harlan. We will need something more.
Yeah.
And to be somebody that's in that place, who's not perhaps close with this person, right? Because it can be dangerous to say something that could trigger something further, or
Right.
that minimizes or dismisses what their experience is. So, and we can't say it's okay, you're safe, because we don't know what will make them feel safe. In these scenarios, truly, one of the most important things to ask is, where do you feel safe? With whom do you feel safe?
Right.
Can you discuss this with, people that you feel safe with? You're not alone. I can help you find somebody to feel safe with. I mean, so that they don't feel like you're
Right.
just throwing them off. But to say things like I say in the beginning of my book, like, I hear you, I hear you, I see you, I see what you're saying, can be a really just easy way of connecting and a very quick way. But at the end of the day, to offer advice in a way that is non-clinical to somebody who's going through a pretty clinical and important and, somewhat precarious situation mentally, it's not really the right path. So
Right.
I would always ask where they feel safe, if they feel safe, with whom they feel
Right.
safe, and would they feel safe talking to somebody?
Yeah. And I think this is true of students who are going to college, who are in a new place, surrounded by new people. I talk a lot about a mental health transition plan. And a mental health
Mm,
transition plan is really about making sure you have your people and you have your places in an unfamiliar world where everything is so new, having some familiarity, having some sort of plan, so that when you deal, it's not if, when you deal with something that's uncomfortable, I think really what we've pointed out, and you've done a beautiful job, is if some of these things that students experience in college, when it comes to like a loss of friends or not getting into a fraternity or sorority or organization or being excluded or a roommate not responding a certain way, and they seem like small responses, like why these are not such a big deal to other people, but they are so closely connected to so many events in our life that
mhm.
can
Yeah.
be traumatic, that can trigger these responses. I think for you, like you
Mhm.
reminding me, because I mean, I've seen these situations every year, 30 years I've been doing this, and it's the
Yeah.
same situations every year. And I try to tell people, I try to say, here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to make you uncomfortable. Here's how you can be supported. But then when they're in it, their brains go into that trauma response. I think for parents, it's really important to understand this.
Yeah. And I mean, look, if I can even just spew a little bit of my dissatisfaction with college institutions themselves, 37 to 44% of college students will experience, or at least stated that they've experienced, significant different types of losses during college. That's a big number. And we don't talk enough about how the classroom absence policy, quote unquote, doesn't talk about mental health challenges, doesn't talk about bereavement leave. Their policies do not take into account anything that is indicative of somebody's real life challenges. We take for granted family privilege. We take for granted culture. I mean, there's so many things that college campuses get wrong, and we're putting a lot of the onus on parents and students themselves. But what happens to the institutions? What responsibility can they play, and what can they do as professors or educational leaders to help create an atmosphere where students feel safe enough to be able to talk about what's going on, to discuss misconceptions around grief, where there's empathy training for professors and college leaders? So, you know, grief or mental health challenges, as you know, and you deal with a lot too, seeps into every part of it, right? With any kind of job, we just have to talk. And by the way, bereavement leave is a different story altogether. But in college and school, right, we have to talk to, as a student, every professor separately. There's no, central booking, like we have, as employees, we can talk to one place. Students have the responsibility of trying to get extensions for exams, and it's at the discretion of the professor. And so for me, I feel like in a lot of my work is with college students. So for me, I get a little bit aggravated that there isn't more support, that there isn't more grief training, there isn't more grief informed leadership in any capacity. There's no space to make room for kids with mental health challenges, young adults with mental health challenges, in a way that provides resources and compassion, as opposed to, here's, you better just go talk to the college, therapist or the school counselors, which aren't equipped, for the most part, to deal with long-term care. And I just feel like we're really sometimes doing a huge disservice to our students, leaving them to their own devices to figure out what to do next. And there's so much there. There's so much that I could get into.
Well,
but
I just want to ask you, I'm not going to keep you much longer, but this idea of speaking directly to the administrators, speaking directly to the professors, to the support staff, because I'll turn this into a clip that you speaking directly to them and offering some solutions, or at least one or two things. What can they do when they're listening to this and acknowledging, what, I don't have an environment, I don't have a classroom that's really grief informed, and I am grief illiterate, and what can they do? What can we do right now?
I think one of the things we have to actually acknowledge is that as a college professor or college leadership, you will be in a situation with these numbers, as 37 to 44% of college students having a significant loss of some kind in their life during college. It's important to know that you will, in your classroom, you will, had or, currently have somebody who's experiencing grief. And one of the things that we have to even do ourselves is look at our own views around loss, look at our own myths and misconceptions around loss, look at our own cultural ideas around loss, and get real about it. We have to make space in our classrooms and in our office hours to be able to be fully present and compassionate with students, and really hear their story, hear what their needs are, to be present with resources, but also constant empathy. We don't get empathy training at all on a college campus. But the truth is that if we don't have the proper language, if we don't have the proper training or understanding on trauma or loss, which is so prevalent in college students, even on campus, look at college student shootings. It's there, it's right in front of our faces. If we don't have empathy training, we can bring more violence to what is already a very, very precarious, unpredictable, turbulent situation in grief for our students. I think making the space, making understanding, have empathy training, and understanding that our students are experiencing multiple mental health challenges, grief being one of them, and that bereavement leave policy needs to be looked at individually in every course, that it shouldn't just be about immediate, family members, but that a conversation needs to be had and space needs to be made for students to be able to explain what loss they're going through and what that experience is. Many times it is up to the discretion of a professor to give time off or to extend deadlines for exams or papers, etc. And the truth is that I've had people come to me where they've been rejected, and their plea has been either given 3 extra days or perhaps, no time at all. And if you're Jewish, and you have 7 days Shiva, for example, I'm just talking culturally, that's just not going to cut it. In Islam, religion, 40 days for grieving. Every culture has its own sort of ritual and routine that needs to be taken into account. And these things are not taken into account in college campuses. I know it's hard, but if professors and college leadership can be very present, make space, have more empathy and compassion, and look at the real life situation within loss, with these numbers being so high, perhaps we can actually have children, or not children, but our students not dropping out, not having to take leaves of absence, not failing, out of classes or withdrawing, and or succumbing to self-medicating, numbing, drugs, alcohol, or other self-destructive habits. We can be the people who are present and can help and support them. It's everything. It's truly everything. And I feel really strongly about it because I see this every day in my work.
Yeah, well, I see it in my work as well. When
Yeah.
students need help, they struggle advocating for themselves. And when they do advocate for themselves, when they're faced with someone who isn't empathetic and is more focused on the material than the student, it really is, it's upsetting, and it probably
Yeah.
is triggering in terms of trauma that's already present, in terms of feeling safe and feeling heard. And I think some professors, they don't want to be taken advantage of. And they feel that, how many grandparents are going to die? And it's the joke, the running joke
Yeah.
of dealing with the death. But my thought is, if someone wants to take advantage of that, then so be it. That's just something that they have to live with. But for the students, and the majority of students are dealing with real loss and real feelings, and they need someone
Yeah.
who's going to be understanding. So that's okay. It's okay if someone
Yes.
takes advantage. I have a philosophy: if you want to take advantage of me and my kindness, then there's clearly something wrong with you. It's okay. I've got enough.
Or you have different needs.
I have more. I have enough
Mhm.
kindness, and if you want to do that, so be it. And if I'm noticed someone who's the empathetic individual who you could take advantage of, well, then clearly there's something going on in your life. If you're drawn to someone, and if you're someone who needs me, and that can be helpful, then great. Like I'm okay with that. And I think that a lot of people in leadership positions sometimes they fail to recognize that. And I want to wrap this up, but I do want to just understand 37% to what was the number of students who experienced some sort of loss during their college years?
Yes. So it is 37 to 44%. And that was research taken from the Education Resource Information Center. And that was of 2023. I don't have the numbers for 2024 yet. But that is a high number. And so, a lot of this is really spawned by the idea that we have to advocate for, number one, not just looking at the absence policy, but really looking at bereavement policy for students, and making it very clear, and perhaps having a central place for a student to go within administration, so that they don't have to go to every single professor and put even more pressure on them, because grief is going to seep into every part of their life. So it is really important, and there's a lot of different factors involved with college students, just like you said, different types of grief. But we also have the idea that we assume that students, this student who says they'll take advantage, they assume that there's family privilege, and it's really hard. We have students all the time coming from backgrounds that are marginalized in some way, or they've been kicked out of their families. There's so many things where they are in a situation where they do not feel safe. Allow them to feel safe on your college campus. Allow them to feel safe in your classroom. This is one of the biggest responsibilities we can have, and one of the biggest gifts we can give to a college student, especially one who's suffering.
Gina, is there anything else that you want to communicate to this audience that I haven't touched on that's really important to you?
I think so. And it came off of a very wild ride in the comment section of a video I was tagged in recently. And, and it's the idea of compare and despair. I think that people of a certain age, and so many people, compare their losses or compare their hardships or compare their pain to another person. They often think that they're doing it wrong. They often think that they should be doing it differently or better, or they should feel better by now. And I want to say something to that, because it really invalidates the experience and the individual experience and needs. Every loss matters, whether it is a death loss, a friendship loss, a breakup, or not getting a job, or doing poorly on a test. The grief that associates with any of these things of disappointment or transition, it's valid and it matters. And one of the things we are so taught to do in the society is to sweep it under the rug, to say we're fine, to bypass, to be stronger, and to hurry up and move on. And the truth is that's detrimental to our long-term mental health. It is okay to be sad, to cry. It is okay to take time out for yourself. It's okay to make other plans and not show up to obligations, if you can't do it. I think it's important to listen to our body, to listen to our feelings, to feel our feelings, to allow ourselves to express what we can in a safe way to a safe person. but most of all, to come to ourselves with compassion. And we often don't do it. We often just berate and bully ourselves into feeling better or getting better. And it is okay to feel like shit. And so I say this, please don't compare. Your loss matters, and you don't have to go this alone. You just really, truly don't. So keep reaching out. Sorry, Harlan, I'm going to say keep reaching out to Harlan, or you can reach out to me as well. I am filled with resources and referrals. I'm in New York City, but I'm on Instagram as well if you just need some extra support in any way. So, so thank you for that.
That was going to be my final question. You have a wonderful social media account. You are so accessible. You're putting this out there. And if there's anything I can do to support what you're sharing and the community of people who are in need, I'm in your corner, I'm in their corner. How can people get in touch with you? What's the way to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. You can just go to my website. I love saying it, ginamoffa.com. Or you can find me on Instagram. It's Gina Moffa, LCSW, all one word. Those are probably the two best ways to get a hold of me. My email, phone number, all of the information is in both of those places. And Harlan, I want to do more work with you because I feel like we could do some good together.
I completely agree. And I am so grateful to be able to visit with you. And I hope people will get your book. Moving On doesn't mean letting go. It's in all forms, however you consume books, whether it's an audio book, a Kindle book, the hard copy of the book. Yes.
I love it.
So I want to be here to do what I can do. So let's figure this out. And maybe we could just even do like a half-hour Q&A.
Great.
Just something. That's really prescriptive because I want people to always leave with something. So anyway, we know each other. This is the beginning of a long relationship. So thank you for being.
I have one question to you.
Yeah.
How do you feel about grief right now?
How do I feel about grief after this conversation?
Yeah. You didn't want to talk to me, so
I'm still scared of it. I still find it scary because I still jump to, when I hear the word grief, I jump to the loss of the people I love the most who are living, breathing, thriving. And that part really scares me. But then there's this other part of like, oh, wait, okay. First of all, I have a rhythm and there are grooves in my brain that will help me to work through whatever comes my way. And my philosophy is no matter what, it's going to be okay.
It's okay to be scared.
I'm scared, but
it's okay to be scared,
and I'm gonna be. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I've been better at sharing. I'm scared, but I know that I will be okay. And I'm also very comforted knowing that all the losses that have been part of my life, and I hope others are comforted, those losses have really informed you and will help guide you and support you. And you're okay now. And you will continue to be okay. And it will be hard, but you'll be okay. And grief is just another thing that you're going to work through.
And it's okay if you're not okay for a while. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. And however long it takes for you to be okay. And for however long you feel okay, that's okay. Everything.
I love it.
So I feel better. And I feel more informed and just feel grateful. Thanks, Gina.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Harlan. And we're going to be doing more of it. So the more you talk about it, the more it will feel more comfortable, I think. So thank you for this.
I am all for dipping my toes into the uncomfortable. And I'm lucky that you're here and there's so many people in so many people's corner. So we're going to keep doing it all together. So
thank you.
Thank you.